Happy Friday, everybody. Today we're going to look at the book of Esther, and this is a small historical book in the Old Testament, right after Ezra and Nehemiah, right before the book of Psalms, actually right before Job. And we're going to look at Esther from a very interesting perspective. There was a Russian literary critic by the name of Mikhail Bakhtin, and he was very influential in literary circles. And he was particularly known for looking at works from a sort of an absurdist point of view. And so we're going to, and it came to be named after him. It's known as the Bakhtinian reading. And so we're going to look at the book of Esther as from a Bakhtinian or absurdist perspective. Esther is a novella, really a diaspora novella. That's a short story that comes from the Jewish diaspora that is outside of the land of Israel. And we're going to look at it from a carnivalesque reading, a carnival in the sense of Mardi Gras, Carnival in Brazil. If you know anything about those traditions, Carnival uses the absurd, the ambiguous, the grotesque to challenge power, and it's a fun time as well. But it's also a way of challenging power. So in San Antonio, for example, excuse me, during Fiesta, there's always a king, El Rey Feo, the ugly king, who is chosen as one of the officiants of Fiesta here in San Antonio. Or there's King Comus at Mardi Gras, who's the god of anarchy and chaos. And these absurdities challenge power by addressing it directly. They don't beat around the bush. They just challenge it directly. So this is the way we're going to read the book of Esther today. So we're going to, we'll start with the first couple of chapters, and it's fairly long, so I'm not going to read these chapters to you. But chapters 1 and 2 introduce two women, Vashti, who's the queen, and Esther, who is a young Jewish girl. So the king throws this big party, and he summons his queen, Vashti, into his presence because he wants to display her beauty before his male guests. He wants to show her off. She's apparently his trophy wife. So, but Vashti refuses. Well, why is that? Well, some rabbis suggested that when the king summoned Vashti to appear before his guests wearing her crown, the implication was that she was supposed to appear before his guests wearing only her crown, and she just refused to do that. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. But we can already see some exaggerations, some absurdities in the first couple of chapters. The feast itself lasts for 6 months, 180 days. That's a bit of an exaggeration. The presumed effects of Vashti's refusal to appear before the king, they blow it all out of proportion. This suggests that the story is a folk tale or even a farce rather than something that was intended to be pure history. Now, we're talking primarily about the Hebrew version of Esther. There's a Greek version as well that came along later. It translated the Hebrew, but it also modified it and it supplemented it with additional sections. In a way, it kind of historicizes it, and it plays down some of the absurd aspects of the story and adds pious reflection. So we're going to focus on the Hebrew version of the story. So Vashti refuses to appear before the king, and this is what the king's servants say to him. They say, "This deed of the queen will be made known to all women, causing them to look with contempt on their husbands, since they will say, 'King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, and she did not come.' This very day the noble ladies of Persia and Media, who have heard of the queen's behavior, will rebel against the king's officials, and there will be no end of contempt and wrath." So this one woman's refusal to play her husband's games, they say, will spread like wildfire throughout the Persian Empire, and before long, no woman, no wife will pay any attention to what her husband says, and that, of course, cannot stand. Vashti refused to be treated like an object. She demanded recognition of herself as a person, and so the male nobles, and likewise, I think, the male narrator, see this behavior as very dangerous because Vashti is challenging the social norm, which is, of course, patriarchy. In response, the full power of the state is marshaled against her, and so the king's advisors, they say, if it pleases the king, let a royal order go out from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it may not be altered, so that Vashti is never again to come before the king. Well, she didn't want to come before the king in the first place, so I don't see how that's such a big deal. And she said, so when this decree is made by the king and is proclaimed throughout his kingdom, vast as it is, all women will give honor to their husbands, high and low alike. So they send all these letters out throughout the entire kingdom, every province in its own script, every people in its own language, declaring that every man should be master of his own house, because that was threatened by this one woman's refusal to be treated like an object. Well, with Vashti removed from the throne as queen, it opens up a place for Esther. Now, Esther is introduced in the second chapter, and she's a young, beautiful Jewish woman who the king doesn't know that she's Jewish. She hasn't said anything about who her relatives are. But the king sees her, and he invites her to join his harem. And eventually she is chosen queen. Now, I should point out that this is kind of absurd as well, because according to Jewish law, the food that they would eat, people would eat in the harem, the concubines who were in the harem, and that's what Esther becomes, is a concubine, is contrary to Jewish law. Not to mention having sex with the king, as the concubines would do, was something that was contrary to Jewish law. However, Esther, it's important to understand, was not a pious story. Rather, it is, at least the way we're reading it, it is sort of a farce. And so Esther doesn't reveal her true identity, her true heritage, and this is a common motif in literature. Joash, the baby son of the king who was killed, is hidden by one of the functionaries of the court, and he's revealed when he's 7 years old to be the king. Jesus, even, according to some readings of the Gospels, particularly the Gospel of Mark, Jesus hides who he is as Messiah. This is the so-called messianic secret idea. The story of the Princess and the Pea is a story where someone hides their identity. Or Gatsby, Jay Gatsby in The Great Gatsby, or Aragorn in Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter even. So this idea of hiding your true identity and having it revealed at the appropriate time is something that's common to literature. Eventually, Esther is elevated to queen. This is another absurdity because women in the harem, as I said earlier, were concubines and thus of lower classes. They weren't of the proper class to assume the title of monarch, but be that as it may, this is the kind of story that we have. All right, in chapter 3, we have the introduction of a man by the name of Haman. He is called a descendant of Agag, the Amalekite, and if we go all the way back to a story in 1 Samuel, he would be the natural enemy of Mordecai, Esther's uncle, because Mordecai is from the tribe of Benjamin, and King Saul, was also from the tribe of Benjamin, and Saul had this feud with the Amalekites, and eventually Saul doesn't kill him. The prophet Samuel kills Agag, who was the ancestor of Haman. So you have this setup where these people are enemies of one another, and that's going to play out as the story moves along. So, don't have time to talk about the whole story, but Haman gets very upset with Mordecai. I mean, just way over the top upset with Mordecai because Mordecai doesn't bow to him, and Haman is just offended beyond measure, and his proposed reaction is just completely ridiculous. Because Mordecai didn't bow to me, I'm going to slaughter all the Jews in the Persian Empire. And the name of the feast associated with this incident is Purim, which is Hebrew for lots, because Haman cast lots to see what day the Jews would be slaughtered, and it came out that it was the 13th day of the 12th month. And there's all sorts of other exaggerations in the story that we don't have time to get into in great detail. But for example, the idea that anyone who appeared before the king uninvited would be executed. Haman's 50 cubit, which is about a 75-foot gallows that he builds. Haman leading Mordecai through the streets on the king's horse. Haman's so-called assault of Esther. And finally, the edict that allowed the Jews to turn the tables. Of course, the Jews are not killed, but the Jews turn around and kill 75,000 Persians. That seems extremely unlikely for a Persian king to have done. But again, if we read it from an absurdist perspective, it makes perfectly good sense. It's in keeping with the other Bakhtinian elements of the story. So, to wrap up, the original queen, Vashti, stands against the absurdity. She tells the king no, whereas Esther participates in it and ends up saving her people because she participates in it, and she herself benefits from it. So if we were to read this from a feminist perspective, Vashti would be the hero. But if we read it from an absurdist perspective, Esther can be seen as the hero, well, the heroine in the story.